Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Modern Day Apocrypha. Today is a super special episode because we're probably going to offend some people. Hooray.
It's all part of the fun, right, Tony? What are we talking about that's going to kind of borderline, maybe offensive, maybe not? We'll see where people lie.
Yeah. Today's topic comes with a little bit of a disclosure. If you are easily offended, go ahead and click to the next episode. We're talking about political correctness. And so there's probably no way to have this conversation without getting in and around it. And we'll probably fuck it up, but that's what we do. It's going to be good.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as Tony mentioned, it's hard to talk about political correctness and have a legitimate conversation, regardless of what position you have, without talking about some things that people may find offensive. Like,
right.
That's just kind of almost by nature what the topic is. But with that being said, one of the questions that I wanted to talk about here, and we can get into it now or we can push it off, but can you talk about difficult subjects without offending anyone? Like, when you really get into some of the meat and potatoes of these controversial conversations, it seems like if you want to talk about anything that is meaningful, people's emotions get involved naturally, and that's just part of the play.
So I think a short answer for that is yes, we can absolutely have some of these conversations without people getting offended. But in order for that to happen, you have to have an open mind and be willing to hear the depth of what someone's saying without them getting the first part of what they're saying that's probably pretty triggering, and you jump to conclusions and lash. You have to hear the whole thing. And then if it is still offensive to you, express that, and that's where the conversation happens. But I don't see a lot of that happening. I see a lot of times like political correctness almost being used as a weapon for you offended me, you're wrong. And it voids any type of conversation to see if that statement's even valid.
Yeah, that's right. And so it kind of builds into the cancel culture mentality.
For sure.
Not kind of, definitely does. That seems to be where cancel culture stems from. Instead of doing that, though, I think that we can all take a step back and think about, what is it that I'm trying to get from this person? If you're somebody who wants to imbue an idea on somebody about how we're supposed to be speaking, what kind of language we're supposed to be using, I want you to carefully consider what your end goal is. Is it to deplatform somebody, or is it to actually get somebody to see another side? Because if it's the other side, then you need to look at ways to enlighten somebody who may not be thinking along the same lines as you are, having the same experiences, or have the same background and culture that you came from.
Definitely. Forcefulness is never a way to convince somebody, in my opinion. I can't remember who told this phrase to me, but if you force feed somebody cake, they'll still throw it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that.
And so, I mean, I don't like cake, but I'm weird. But most people like cake or whatever the fuck it is that you're trying to feed somebody. If you shove it down their throat, they're going to gag and they can't take it. So whatever the thing is that you're passionate about, that you love and want someone else to experience and see your point of view, you can't be harsh and like, fuck you, I'm right.
Right. Yeah, that's doesn't do anybody any good to have that kind of mindset and those quick, stark reactions like that. You touched on something interesting that I want to get into at some point, but
Okay.
It's about the topic of coercion and when it comes to political correctness, because there's going to be a little bit of a dichotomy, if you will, about what you said versus something else that I think will come up later on in the conversation. But before we get too far in, Tony, I'm excited. We've got this badass new setup. Got a nice little wall behind us. Got some new camera angles going. We're in a whole new room.
We got a new table. We're closer together. I mean, Nick and I could make out. We're not that close.
We're not that close in relationship or in physical space.
Truth.
But it could happen.
It could happen. Stay tuned.
Well, welcome everybody. Seriously, appreciate you being here and listening in. And as Tony kicked us off, you know, talking about political correctness can definitely get us into some hairy topics. We just ask that everybody here comes in, joins the conversation with the same mindset that we've always been trying to establish, which is this podcast is about exploring different ideas, not from a position of influence, not from a position of expertise, but again, we delve in, get an understanding of what's going on with each of the topics that we cover, and then have a conversation, often with differing opinions.
And the more we go on, the more I actually really appreciate the differing opinions, because if Nick and I look at the same shit the same way, it's just an echo chamber. And there's plenty of that shit. This actually helps me grow every week. And I didn't see it that way. I was an asshole. Thanks, Nick.
Agreed, totally. And I have those same thoughts coming from not only your opinions, but also the things that I say. Because sometimes I'll sit down and think like, you know, when I said that, it didn't feel right coming out. Like it wasn't my actual thoughts. And it makes me go back and think, am I repeating something that I've heard before? And adopting somebody else's ideology that might have sounded catchy or something like that at the time. But when you sit down and think about it, that may not be your actual individual thoughts. And I think that's where like originality stems from too.
Yeah, it's been interesting, this whole journey. When we started it, I remember we had some conversations off air going, I don't know if I really want to talk about this, because that means I'm putting my real perspective out into the world, and that's scary.
It is scary.
And my grandma might hear it, and oh well, it's better to be authentic. And I've enjoyed the challenge of sifting through my own perspectives and beliefs, and it's been a good trip so far.
Yeah, so without getting too far off the topic that we're here to cover, I would say that doing the podcast has actually been interesting from exactly what you just said, where we're putting our perspectives out into the world. It's recorded. Anybody can download it and spread it. I can do the same thing. You can do the same thing. It can disrupt the rest of our established lives that we had.
It's exciting.
But what was really cool is that doing it on a podcast is kind of like jumping into the pool. When you're sure that water's cold, you're not dipping your toe in. You just have to commit to it and jump. Podcast was kind of the same thing. It's like that hesitation, upload.
Well, especially in the form that we're doing it. You know, there's a lot of different ways you can do a podcast, and ours, we just hit record, and what's there we put up. And
there's no cuts or anything.
No cuts, no edits. So what happens. And, you know, there's other shows that are cut and they have different shots and it's more produced. And hey, more power to them. I'm lazy and I didn't want to have to do that every week. So you get the raw, real, here's what it is. And I think it fits better with the idea of our podcast anyway.
Absolutely. Well, and even barring the laziness part, once we added additional camera angles, it's the same work because it's just a whole bunch of cuts, but they're different camera angles, but it's all a live recording, one cohesive stream. So yeah, it's been fun. But when we get into topics like political correctness, it starts to be like, woo, all right, here we go.
Yep, here we go. Jumping off that cliff.
So, Tony, I'll let you take the first step off the cliff, sir. What is political correctness to you? Did you look up a definition, or is this going to be your own thought?
I did look up a definition because I have my own preconceived notions, like I typically do with any topic that we jump into. And my preconceived notion was that political correctness is bullshit. Let's see what the internet says. And the internet gave a much more elegant description, gave validity to the term and practice itself. So what I had found was that political correctness it has the intent to be not offensive to anyone, and it's super sensitive of any and all that are listening. So in today's day and age, with the internet, you're recording something, now you're super sensitive to fucking the world. Not just, here's the people in this room that I have to be aware of. Could be anyone.
Because everybody has a voice, and they can weigh in, comment on whatever content you're producing. Yeah. And so to me, it gets down to this topic of, can you please everybody? And
no.
The general consensus is no, you cannot. That's why I asked the question earlier, can you talk about these difficult subjects without offending anyone? I don't think you can have a legitimate conversation where you're getting an adequate representation of everybody's views without offending somebody. Because I think for so many people, their emotions get in the way of the actual message and what's being said and what's intended to be said.
Well, then you tie worldview beliefs to some of these differing opinions and realize that person A's belief is completely opposed to person B's, and both think that there are existential consequences for the other person's actions. And that's where all this passion and stuff happens. And so you get triggered, your emotions flare up, and all you can see is, oh my God. And it's probably all based in fear, because I want the world to succeed. I think most people do. And if you see the world through a certain lens, whether that lens is right, wrong, indifferent, you assume it's the right view. And therefore you want to project that view and make the world fit that, so that the world and your life and how you see things can succeed. But what you don't understand is someone sees the exact opposite of you and they're wanting the same thing. It's like two forces that are just pushing up against each other, because all there is that emotions. And unless you let that fade, hear the other person out and see what can be changed. And a lot of times this shit ain't going to change. You got the right, you got the left. People on both sides may cross over and change, but overall, both of those things are probably going to have their own version of a camp. You've got capitalism, you've got communism, you've got whatever.
All these polarities.
And realizing that I don't think one is necessarily right or wrong. It's this whole duality thing. That's the con, I think. And I think that's what the layer beneath political correctness. Everyone wants to be right because everyone wants to be validated in what they're doing. And so then things like political correctness happen, and then you get to stand behind, no, but this is politically correct. Typically the people on the other side of that go, no, but this is actually true. No, but this, based on their perspective. And it's this constant fight, missing that here we are fighting bullshit instead of working together and making things a better place to live.
Yeah, it goes back to emotions getting in the way, and they're kind of blinding the core message. What do you think the purpose political correctness plays in society?
What do you mean?
Like, what is... So behind the political correctness movement, if you want to call it a movement, and I'm not trying to like position this as a leftist issue or a rightist issue or anything like that. I'm trying to get to the bottom of why people are concerned about the words that other people use. So, and maybe it'd be helpful to give some examples. I put down just some different thoughts that came to my mind. When I grew up, when I was younger, saying midget to refer to a little person today was totally fine. Or maybe it wasn't totally fine because I was young, and so I may have just not ever been taught that it wasn't okay.
Sure.
But it goes back to exactly that. It's like legitimate ignorance or innocence, and there's no level of offensiveness being implied from the person who's saying the word midget.
Right.
Now, if so when I say something like that, if there's if there are roots in discrimination or something with the word midget,
right,
then I can understand like there's a historical context there. Maybe a better example would be like the Washington Redskins, the American football team. I like football, Tony. I know you don't, so I'll give you a background.
I grew up with it, but still explain.
Okay. So this past season, a long controversial topic about the Washington Redskins football team referring to Native Americans as Redskins, which has a derogatory connotation. I assume. I didn't actually look into the history of it, but you can understand how calling somebody a redskin might have had some historical context from when the Europeans were settling America and moving out to the West, and all of the different things that went on with the Trail of Tears. I don't know. Again, I didn't look into the background here, but I can see how calling somebody a redskin would have a derogatory connotation to it.
Sure.
So from that point, it seems like that's a valid example of political correctness, where that indigenous community wants mainstream media, or at least a football team, to not be called the Redskins because it has something that is like legitimately offensive and is really founded in history and like actions that had taken and afflicted that people. When it comes to midget, That may be the same case. I really don't know, but it seems like probably not. Like that word probably didn't have anything offensive associated with it, and maybe it grew to become offensive.
So I think the core of it probably goes back to a version of what we'd call today as like toxic masculinity, because the picture that's been painted is like, I'm big, I'm physical, I'm a giant, I'm a man. And so if you weren't that, I'm gonna call you a midget.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I think there's probably that's probably where that came from. Mm-hmm. Another along those lines, like growing up for me, you're going to ask something before I go.
Well, I was going to ask, but then could calling somebody a little person in 20 years evolve to have that same negative connotation?
It could. And I think that's one of the challenges with political correctness is that where's the line? Because if we continue to cancel words, hi back, bye. Like,
right.
You know what I mean? Because people are going to continue to get offended. And I'm not saying we should dismiss that. I feel like people and their perspectives are validated. I'm not trying to invalidate people. But I feel like there's this bigger, harder discussion that has to be had. Because how do you navigate this stuff? And how do we fix some things? And sure, some of these things probably shouldn't be repeated, like the N-word. I think we're pretty aligned on that. Like, we shouldn't use that.
That's one that is rooted in historical context.
Right.
Like, there's a logical conclusion about why that word is offensive.
Right. Or something, you had mentioned when you were a kid, saying midget, and it was ignorance. I think the same for me, but the word I would use is like, oh, that's gay.
Yeah, gay. That's another good one.
And I didn't know, like, at the time, I was, in a small town and, was raised pretty conservative. I didn't know any gay people.
Yeah.
So it wasn't real. It wasn't derogatory based on a person. So in my context, for me and my reality, even though someone might have been offended by that, my intention was along the same lines of saying a your mom joke. I don't really mean your mother. I've met your mother. She's nice and fantastic. I'm not going to say jokes about your actual mom, but it's the theoretical your mom, or not a specific she, but that's what she said, And I think what people don't understand on the other side who are getting offended is the intention behind what people are saying. And it's hard to differentiate that intention unless you open a discussion and have a real relationship with somebody. Because take a quote, take a recording, a clip out of something, and it could sound pretty damning on somebody. But if you don't know that person and don't know that, hey, he was just a small town kid who didn't know that it's offensive to call people gay. Oh, I'm sorry. And you know what? Today, sometimes I still do it out of habit. I catch myself and go, there's a better way to say that, but it's a process. And I don't think, because of how fast some of these things are moving and the amount of changes that are happening, and people want it to be accepted and normalized overnight, you got to give people a chance to catch up. And you can't be offended that people have just decades long, or sometimes lineage and generations long culture of saying, well, it's not right. Hey, that's gay. You know what I mean?
Right.
You have to give time for things to catch up, and you can't be offended that things slowly change. Things just slowly change.
And it does change.
It does.
Things do change. Another one came to mind, but without getting into it too much. Again, I'm not trying to be offensive with my comment. It's a legitimate description of somebody. But when you have mentally handicapped people, I think that to say that they are delayed or held back in terms of progress, development, or accomplishment, maybe even take off accomplishment. I know plenty of mentally challenged people that run businesses and things and do really cool things like that.
Right.
But to say that they've been delayed or held back in terms of progress and development, I think is a very valid description of most, or many at least, mentally handicapped people. And that's the actual definition of the word retarded. Like flame retardant. It holds back flames.
Right.
And so, again, this is like, people even say the R word, and I totally understand that. And so I'm not trying to be derogatory. But what we've done is we've taken the word and completely added definitions that don't belong.
For example,
retarded. Like, we're not using, like, you're not allowed to use the word as it's actually intended.
What are the definitions that have been added is what I'm getting at.
Oh, I see. Maybe not definitions that have been added. Maybe I misspoke there, but it's like it's implied to be mean and spiteful and a negative word. And the more that I thought about that, because I've pretty much cut that word out of my vocabulary altogether.
It's an old habit one that pops up from time to time, but every time I say it, I'm like, fuck, that came out again.
So on that one, but just because it's got the definition, I feel like people should recognize it for the word that it is and the meaning that it is. But I think what has happened, and this is probably true for gay and some of these other words, what happens is that people use those words with a negative connotation not to talk about somebody who is mentally handicapped. And so they would say, like, if you tripped and fell or something, you might be like, dude, are you retarded? Quit doing that or something.
Right.
And so there you see where we're associating that word and pulling it away from its actual definition in some way and using it to be a really negative jab, an insult.
Yeah, and I think culture comes into play here. So, yes, I hear you, and it would be nice to be able to use this word in the way that it's defined. Oh, that's held back. That's retarded. Not in a derogatory sense, but okay, that makes sense. But also knowing your audience, back when I used to do corporate training, I would say things differently based on the audience who's in the room, knowing how it's going to connect with it. So you have to be aware of who's listening to you, because using things in a certain way, there are these instant triggers that no matter how hard you try to reframe or redefine or reuse a word, it's still going to flip that switch.
Right. Yeah, there's no going back.
Right.
Like, we're never going to go back to being okay with the word retarded.
Right.
Like, that's just not going to happen. But it's just like an interesting thought experiment. And what it came down for me was I was trying to understand how these words evolve in the way that they do, because language is always evolving. Like, go back and look at, go read the Declaration of Independence. The language that they use is English, but they use words that would not be commonplace today.
And henceforth thou wilt do this
right.
for thine brethren.
We don't speak like that anymore.
Yep.
So yeah, it's interesting. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of slang eventually becomes more and more accepted, like gonna and wanna and things like that.
Well, and I think going back to, maybe how retarded started, that rhymed. Maybe it was someone being clever to say, you're held back. And it wasn't necessarily this derogatory term. It was clever wording. But then how it got picked up and continued, it wasn't your mom joke that the culture ended up seeing it as. Somebody along the line, in a mass way, saw this as offensive. And so things shifted, and it's, again, that evolution of language. And right. I think we find some of these struggles where people want to shift and move forward and go, hey, no, we used to say this, and this isn't okay anymore. And I think for the that's not okay anymore crowd, you have to admit that either due to ignorance or a lower level of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, at some point it was previously okay. You have to acknowledge that in order for progress to be made. Because otherwise you're just assuming that this has always been wrong, and then you're just the one standing up for saying it's right. That doesn't help anybody grow or change. Kind of like, we used to own people. And some parts of the world we still do, but in this country, we used to physically own people. That's not cool anymore. But in order to move through that progression and recognize the change and the shift, we have to recognize that that was culturally accepted as normal back then. And so while we see it as fucked up today, we don't know what it was like to live 100 years ago and see that through those ignorant lenses. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a big missing piece of the conversation to make progress go forward. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like, my initial thoughts are like, when it comes to slavery, like you brought up, it's so hard to even get into the mindset for somebody who is trying to have this open conversation
Yeah.
and be like, even if it was culturally acceptable, how could you do that? You know, and particularly with the egregious examples of slavery where like people were whipped and chained and beaten and all of this stuff. It's like,
here's a hypothetical to give you. I know there's a big shift here in the past X amount of years of people going away from eating meat or animals. And in the front line of that community, I can't believe people eat animals. Mm-hmm. You fast forward maybe to 20 or 100 years. What if culture completely shifts that way where we don't eat meat globally? And then we look back and go, how in the world could they fucking eat meat? How would you do that to an animal? And then they mass produced these animals and did this stuff. And it's just normal to most of the world. I'm not saying we are 100% going that direction, but that's a hypothetical to kind of show you the difference on, it's no big deal. I hunt, I eat, whatever.
I understand the concept that you were describing. It's just hard. So like for me, I'm okay hunting. I think it's okay to eat animals personally. Even when I like add some layer of scrutiny, it's not just the culture around me says it's okay. I personally think that it's okay on like a very individual level. I also personally don't think that it's okay to mistreat animals. And in my mind, mistreatment is this factory farming mass production that happens. I think that's like legitimate abuse. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I see the difference there is because one is adding an incredible amount of unnecessary cruelty, whereas the other is a very direct aspect of life. Killing things to eat them is done by millions and millions and millions of different beings, animals in the world. Like it is just how things survive. Like that is the way that the world works at its core. I think that there's like the ethics involved. Like you should, because we're conscious of it, there should be an effort to make it as painless and as humane as possible.
For sure. But I would challenge and say that you just would have been a very kind slave owner.
Sure.
Right? Yep. You know what? There's no reason to abuse these other humans. Right. But this is just the system of the world. And sometimes we own people and that's how the work gets done. But I take care of them. So it's ethical and it's good.
Yes. I could see that. I could see that happening for sure.
And now today we'd go, but you still own someone. That's fucked up. And I think that's how these, and it takes time. It didn't happen overnight. And a whole fucking country imploded on itself to resolve the decision. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of energy and a lot of moving parts, and there's, we're years away from it, and there's still some people who wish we could own other people. It'll take time, but we'll get there.
Right.
So I think a lot of these things, the whole chargedness of political correctness can be disabled with zooming out, getting a bigger picture and trying to educate the other person or at least see their point of view to make a bridge instead of smacking them with the political correctness stick.
And that takes me into a recent example. There is, I am very not culturally in tune when it comes to celebrities or people with a platform, but there was a recent issue with, I guess, a large YouTuber named KSI. Do you know who this person is?
Nope.
Me neither. But he's got like, I think I looked him up and he had like 20.5 million subs or something. Whew. So he's got a big channel. He's from the UK. He said I think it was the word tranny. It was blocked out in the post, but it was referred to as the T word within the context of transgender.
Right.
And I can't say whether or not he was truly ignorant of the general culture and the movement and everything. That word was acceptable not too long ago, or at least in my mind it was acceptable. And maybe it still had some derogatory tones underneath it. But anyway, he used the word tranny and just got like blown up. And again, he may have known that he shouldn't be using that word, but his position was like, I am astonished that people thought that I was transphobic. I'm very sorry that that happened. like legitimately, I appreciate you letting me know. And like, that's just out of his vocabulary from that point on. So if he's being honest and genuine, then that's an educational moment where you don't have to get nasty to get your point across.
And that's the other part with this, whether it be, you know, the trans community, anything else. You say one thing, and it might be out of ignorance. I don't know how to describe this group of people. And you just say it in conversation, and you just try to pick. When I was a trainer, and there was people from all different nationalities, their names, you just went for it. And they let you know if you got it right or not. And it wasn't this big deal because they know they've got a weird name for English. They get it all the time. You put forth the effort and tried, or you ask, whatever. If there's no bad intent, you can't just come guns blazing and realize, hey, and even in some of these communities, different people want to be called different things. You have to realize that people can't read your mind. And it's okay to kindly speak up and be like, hey, my legal name is Anthony. I'm not a fan of it. But on a lot of places, the bank, wherever, I have to have my legal name. And so they'll try to address me by my first name and say, how's it going today, Anthony? Hey, call me Tony. Okay, no problem. It's not a big deal. You don't have to be salty about it. And I think a lot of these things would smooth a lot over if people were given the opportunity to be wrong and be gently corrected.
100%. And they'd be more receptive to the message that you're trying to get across, which is like, hey, I didn't like that. I hope that you can respect that and move forward, and we'll come to terms in the future.
I think, and I'm speaking out of my ass here, but we're talking about political correctness and people are probably offended already. But specifically for something like someone in the transgender community, you've probably spent a lot of time thinking through that change and transition and whatever internally, or maybe with a close couple of friends. The world hasn't had your same journey of preparedness and getting ready for that. So then when you change and you don't address it and you don't give people that same time frame to come to the same place of that decision, you're giving someone else a shorter version than what you gave yourself.
Right.
And that's not fair. And I'm like, I'm all for whatever. I'm not transphobic. Like, people go do what makes you happy. I don't give a shit. I'm just trying to give you a couple of steps to help people get on board with you to get there. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And even though like there's this overnight, and not just that community, it's just an easy one to use as an example. People make these overnight changes, and this is my new life and my reality. But if it's not been something that's culturally normal for a long time, that has decades or centuries behind it, it's going to take time for culture to accept it as normal. And you just have to accept, I'm a pioneer, I'm on the fringe, I'm something, and I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life explaining this and making this okay.
Society is a big ship, and it takes a long time to turn big ships.
That's a great fucking analogy, dude.
Yeah. Not my words. Somebody else's.
Yeah.
Don't know who. Sorry for the credit.
I'm going to say that's still Nick Johnson quote.
So what is the outcome here? Is it to increase tolerance? Is it to bring more awareness to other people's feelings and perspectives?
I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I don't think anyone wakes up out of bed and says, how do I fuck someone else over? I think everyone's intentions are good. Their execution just needs improvement. And so I think on both sides of the political correctness argument, you've got people who are either ignorant, and yes, there's probably a group of people who are derogatory too. We have to admit that. But for the ignorant, I'm going to just believe that the ignorant crowd is much larger than the derogatory crowd. But if you don't have a chance for a conversation, you're not going to realize that.
Here's an example. I don't know anybody that's in a hate group. I know a lot of people who wouldn't understand what words to use and when.
100%. Absolutely 100%. And even those that aren't 100% in a hate group, but might fall on the lines of something that's more directly opposed to a different belief, they're probably just upset and threatened that their worldview is being challenged. They don't really hate you. All of that anger or whatever, it's just them responding to an external threat. They don't realize that's what's going on. You don't realize that's what's going on, and you think they hate you. It's not really what's going on. Hey, you know what? We think differently. Let's go live in different corners of the world. It's a great big fucking place. You know what? There's different corners of the internet. We don't all have to own all of it. It'll be okay.
In fact, you can make your own corner of the internet.
Yep.
Just set up a website.
Yep.
And away you go.
Yep. One other interesting thing that I think how political correctness happened, or at least again, going back to everyone's intention, I think the intention of where political correctness started was, hey, let's do this right. Let's be intentional about who we're talking about. That's a great intention. I am behind it. When it becomes so, you can't speak or say anything because everyone's going to be offended, that's where shit gets weird. And I think it's a product of how things shift over the years. And so good times make weak people. Weak people make hard times make strong people make good times. That cycle repeats. So let's start at the Great Depression. Real fucking hard times. Those hard times made strong people. Those strong people made really good times. We've been living in these good times, so a lot of us haven't really had to go through anything really hard in real comparison. Great Depression, you didn't know if you were going to eat or not. You had to go fight to just find work to make sure you weren't homeless and your family was fed. Some people still find a version of that, but in comparison, we're still way better off than we were back then. So because we don't have any of these true survival threats, we almost manufacture them because our biology, all of that wiring is still there. I'm offended, I'm being attacked. I have to fight and put this energy so I can survive. And it's no longer our physical stuff that survive. It's our identity and our projected personhood that we've put out on the internet or that we now identify with or whatever. And so in essence, in comparison, we've made weak people. And I'm not shitting on anybody. I'm just saying in comparative life experiences, it's good that we've had good lives, but it makes some of these more not survival issues come to the surface. And in the grand scheme of things, do they necessarily matter for the survival or advancement of our species?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I agree with you in principle. I think that there's a little bit more to be said and credit to be given when it comes to political correctness, and maybe not political correctness directly, but the evolution of society to become more tolerant.
Sure. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I think I shouldn't say everybody, but I think as a general population, the vast majority of people are wanting a more tolerant, a more open, a more accepting society, a more all-inclusive culture. And I had this thought before the podcast, before we started recording, but one of my questions was, is political correctness something that is actually driving that tolerance, or is it part of a larger movement? And I think in general, it's probably part of a broader movement for like, we talk a lot about like women in the workforce.
Sure.
And there's not a lot of political correctness at play when it comes to women in the workforce. I can't think of like these words and the way that you talk about people changing.
It's not wording. Now it falls more into action.
Yes. And so that tells me that there are movements that are driving change in society and culture, and political correctness is probably just this small component that might trigger some awareness about, like, you've heard recently about some of the gender pronouns and things.
For sure.
And that's something that's part of a much larger movement about freedom to be who you are without being ridiculed and to still be accepted. Political correctness is just trying to like voice that, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way because it's forcing people to accept it in a way that they aren't accepting of. And that sounds bad, but I think that the majority of people who take issues with having to use a variety of different gender pronouns have the problem not with transgender people, but with the fact that they're being forced to use certain words that they have to go and learn. And it's like, these are examples of language that's evolving externally, like somebody's forcing you to use language and evolve your language. Whereas we know that language is going to evolve organically without any external pressure. I've never said shall, and what do people even say? Just
henceforth
read the Bible.
and wherefore.
Yes. You went through the whole thing earlier when we were talking about the Declaration of Independence. That shit wasn't offensive to anybody, and it changed. Like, it doesn't take political correctness to make those changes.
Right. I feel like the analogy, the visual picture that I'm getting as you're talking about this, you're forcing other people to, instead of to be able to just walk and live their life, to now walk on eggshells. Because you know what? Someone's going to explode if I don't quite say this right. And I think anytime I've seen that in any shape or form, when people are afraid to fail, progress stops. Because I can't get it wrong, because all of these repercussions are going to be there.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, there's places where we should not want to fail, but for progress and innovation to happen, we have to let failure be an option.
100%.
And learn from it. But right now, with a lot of this political correctness stuff, there's no room to fail. Like that YouTube guy. You know what? He said a term that apparently the world is uncomfortable with, and they lit him up for it and assumed his intention behind it. Hey guys, what the fuck? I thought you knew me better than this. I didn't mean that. Thanks for the education, but fuck all y'all for being, so
nasty
harsh about it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that, how you start, how did they put, honey kills more flies than vinegar. Be sweet about it, be kind about it. Hey, just so you know, that's not so cool anymore. Like if you've got a good friend and someone that you have a relationship with, and they've got shit in their teeth. Hey Nick, you got, not a fuck you, dude. You got shit in your mouth. Sure. You can't do that. Your teeth are supposed to be clean. We're on a podcast. You know what I mean? Like, it's so. And I understand. It goes back to the beginning where we talk about your emotions get into it, and you want it to be a certain way, and you're passionate about it, and it's amazing. But think through your audience and their perspective, and it might be hard and super crazy to see someone else's shoes that you think their perspective is so fucked up and so crazy. But you have to see it that way in order for you to ever have a conversation and truly communicate with them instead of just trying to indoctrinate them, whether you're right or wrong.
You were talking about people have to be allowed to fail, and it has to be culturally acceptable to say something and be called out for. It's okay to call somebody out for it. But just as you said, it's got to be in the right way. There's got to be some finesse to it for it to be received. I thought this would come up earlier in our conversation, but the general notion of freedom of speech is at play here.
That's a great fucking call.
And
how did I miss that?
Well, that's exactly what you were capturing, the essence of why freedom of speech is important, because if you limit people's freedom to speak openly, then you are going to, by nature, remove any opposition to your thoughts, which might help society in general from swinging too far one way or the other. And it's not about acceptance or anything like that, but it's about people being able to learn and not be completely canceled. Like this KSI guy. I know nothing about him other than this is something that happened. That's literally the only thing that I know. And for him, I'm sure he makes his living from doing YouTube. And if he was legitimately not trying to offend anybody and it was just about ignorance, then in my mind, there's no reason to make this guy like completely lose his job, completely lose his platform, have to find out another way to make ends meet. Like that's just completely unacceptable to treat somebody that way for making a mistake or being just a learning moment. Like
there's a difference between making a mistake or doing something wrong and having a pattern. And I know we got to be careful with this because, well, I murdered someone. It was just a mistake. Let me make sure I murdered 3 more people before you prosecute me, officer. Oh, fuck, can't do anything. He hasn't killed 3 people.
Right.
So it's not a blanket statement. But when we're talking about words and language, yes, I understand that like bullying and shit is real and people take that shit real hard and like leads to suicide. And we don't want any of this. So But if people are not educated, it doesn't change. You know, and we have to have that room to safely fail and have that education, or otherwise it's received, well, it might not be your intention, it's just received as bullying back.
Yes. And often in a much more grandiose way.
Yeah.
I think the way that, like this example that we've been referring to with KSI, seems to be that people were much, what they said to him was filled with hate. What he said was a word in not a derogatory way.
Well, I think the other thing too is we have our celebrity culture here in America. So we think so little of ourselves as individuals that we put these people as actors, actresses, YouTube stars, Instagram influencers, TikTok influencers up on this pedestal because we see little clips of them, what they project, whether that be on their influencer page or whatever character they're projecting. And we think they're superhuman and held to these higher standards and all these things. And so when they make a mistake, insta cancel because they should be better than everyone else. And it's really, I think, a projection of where a lot of these people are at.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like they're projecting what you're saying is that people naturally have those same thoughts that a celebrity might have or somebody that's up on this pedestal. But when they do it, that's their opportunity to rise above and patronize that person.
If the person I've put on a pedestal has failed and they're above me and they're who I look up to model, if they failed, I can't look at them. I have to remove them from my worldview and completely not look at them anymore because now I have nothing to aspire to. And if I don't have anything to aspire to, I'm super fucked up and my whole world is crashing.
I see. Yeah, that was kind of like your foundation, your goal, like the keystone that was holding up your vision about how life is supposed to work. And that is part of the problem with the way that social media has evolved or just platforms in general, because I think this goes back to the way that we were talking about our podcast versus some other podcasts or videos and things where people have the opportunity to produce it and cut out things that they didn't like that they said,
right,
and scrub it so that they're maintaining this really polished image, and it's fake.
Or even think just now about with the internet as a whole and how quick shit moves. You know what? There was a newspaper that went out and people maybe talked about it and we faded and went along. There was a mistake. Oops, it was a mistake. Well, now, instead of it just being that newspaper in that town where there was a little scuffle or whatever and those people got a little offended and moved on, now it's the whole goddamn world.
Right.
Someone says something wrong or off, and the whole world is like, fuck that dude.
Here's another one. So one thing that's been happening lately is people are going and canceling people for things that they said 10 years ago.
Right.
This is interesting and well-timed because my girlfriend and I started watching Survivor, and we started from episode 1, and the things that they say on there about like race and gender or maybe not gender, but a lot of times it's ethnicity. I'm like, ooh, that was cringy.
Even episode 1 or 2 in The Office.
Yes.
Diversity Day. And they're all these racist. It's all funny because it's not really derogatory and maybe to some people it is. But to me, I like racist jokes because they're funny, not because I think they're less than. And I'm an equal opportunity joke guy. Like, hey, I'm not thinking less of anybody there.
Right
it's funny sometimes because there's a stereotype and certain cultures do certain things. That's just what it is. It's funny.
Yep.
I like white jokes too. Like, hit me.
So it's interesting, like seeing that and thinking about, wow, this show that's still super popular, The Office, was still like the #1 most watched show.
Right.
And even over The Crown, which had this massive budget and all of this, and nobody's going, maybe nobody, I don't know. Maybe some people are trying to cancel The Office or trying to cancel Survivor. But in certain cases, people are going and finding individuals that have said something 15 years ago that would have been culturally acceptable, to your point earlier. And now it's, times have changed. And that's okay that times are changing. But you can't hold what people said over a decade ago to the same standards that you would hold somebody today.
It honestly, in my opinion, impedes progress or punishes people for progressing. What this says is we never want to advance as a society, because if we do, now there's records of everything, and in 10 years, the word, I don't know, pick anything is now bad. And guess what? Tony and Nick are canceled because they said fuck. Whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Today, it's fine. And we're just being honest and exploring topics, and it's whatever. Culturally acceptable. Nobody was batting an eye. Maybe we weren't woke enough to realize these things are offensive. But in 10 years when we are, culture won't repeat the same things.
I've got a potential example for you.
Hit me.
Do you know that the original footballs were made out of pigskins?
Okay.
So people call it
A pigskin.
A pigskin.
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, I'd love to go out and throw the pigskin. I could see in 30 years when we're not allowed to eat animals anymore that people would be like, what the fuck? You can't call it a pigskin. And that wouldn't be okay. And it's like, nobody...
Cancel the NFL. Cancel it.
Right. Nobody meant anything by it.
Joe, you don't understand. We got to cancel the footballs.
All right, Alex Jones. What I want to go back. I feel like I'm going back a whole lot, but
it's all good.
You've brought up so many good points, talking about how culture seems to evolve to like good times create weak people and bad times create strong people, or something. You
Right.
said something along those lines. I think a lot of it's true, and like I think you started talking about like in the 20s, you had the stock market crash. Then you had really all the way through the 30s, it was the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl was a real prominent chapter in the Midwestern communities. And then you have World War II, which, good God. But if you were growing up in those times, you had so much more to worry about that was a literal matter of life and death.
Right.
And it makes today's issues feel trivial. And they are trivial in comparison to that, because that was like literal survival, and today's is about changing culture and society. That doesn't mean that they're not important. That
Absolutely.
doesn't mean that they're not things that need to continue to evolve and change. But there are a lot of people, if you try to expand and look around the world, that are struggling day in, day out. And we've talked about that before, about people in other countries where you might have the average income per person for a year is $450.
Or fuck, even look at a lot of our big cities and the amount of homeless people that we have that we don't like to talk about. You
There you
know,
go.
it's easy to externalize the problems and the poor outside of our borders because we have so many screens telling us we're not poor as a culture, when we just have, you know, people who know how to portray it and pretend like they're rich. Let me go rent a Lamborghini and film a bunch of shit, and guys, look, I'm a millionaire, buy my shit. No one knows the difference because it's all queued up and visualized just right. Whereas we've got the same shit here. Sure, it's different and maybe worse other places, but it's the same shit.
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm sure being homeless here is probably still better than being homeful, sheltered in Afghanistan or something, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have, at least currently, I say this with a grain of salt, but we don't have bombs going off every couple of weeks and rockets coming into the city, and it's, you know, sure, there's shit that happens, but it's not this daily open war conflict in an area in our country that, you know what? Johnny went to the market today and a bomb went off, and now there's no more Johnny.
It's organized. Whereas most of the instances that happen here are not organized crime.
Right.
What's the difference in political correctness and politeness?
I think the intention behind is probably similar, but politeness, I think, would be that conversation like we've talked about, whereas political correctness is demanded.
That
At
makes
least
sense.
in most applications as I've seen. Now, people who are listening who probably wave the political correctness flag probably wouldn't agree with me, but from what I've witnessed and experienced, and my experience is limited, but I see most of the people who wave the political correctness flag shooting it like a cannon.
Sure. So I think that's a reflection of a lot of people who are promoting that political correctness mindset. When I get to the core of like political correctness could be represented by somebody who is tactful and poised when they're correcting somebody. Like
For sure.
If somebody said, "Hey, KSI, that's not an appropriate word anymore. Most people who are transgender prefer to be called transgender," or whatever the term is. I don't want to speak on behalf of other people. So that's kind of like a reflection of the people that tend to fight for political correctness. But I agree. But I think I would add one more thing to that, and it's like the targeted nature of political correctness, where it's like they've chosen very specific words and maybe not actions. Are there actions that play with political correctness? I can't think of any.
I think it's probably like all in that realm, but I think political correctness, especially for our conversation that we're almost at the hour anyway, we should probably just keep it to
it's usually manifested in words and language.
Right.
Yeah. So it's just very targeted, and like people are being selective about what words you can use. Whereas politeness to me is like this general nature of how you should treat people and be respectful of one another. And it's kind of like do unto others as
good old golden
they
rule.
would do unto you.
Yep.
Yeah, screwed that one up. The golden rule.
No, you got it right. You just stuttered.
Okay, got it.
Nick, it's offensive to say the golden rule now.
Goodness gracious. I'm sorry.
Hey, that was a
Guys.
kind way to do it. That's how you do it, guys.
I'm sorry. I really am. Even if this is like 80 years in the future, from the bottom of my heart, I didn't mean anything by it.
You gonna live that long?
80 more years? Whew. Fuck, dude.
I'm going for
I'm 28 right now.
I'm going for at least 200 more.
Okay. I'm not. We'll see where technology lies.
You know what? I'm talking out of my ass right now. I'm just saying big numbers.
200.
Today, I know I have plenty more life to live, and I'm ready for as much as it'll give me.
What's the record?
At 90,
Like
100,
128 or something?
something like that. At those high levels, I might be getting tired, or I might be happy as fuck and continue moving on.
122.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm going to pronounce it in American first. Jean Louise Calment. But she's French, so is it like Jean-Louis Calment? Jean-Louis Calment. Died at 122 and 164 days old. So
I want to believe that there are probably people in remote communities who have lived much longer than that,
maybe pushing 130.
who haven't been documented,
Yeah, sure.
and they just don't know.
I could believe that. Yeah, so would I push another 80 years? I'd go another 80. 108. I feel like that's about my cutoff, though.
Yeah.
Like 108 years old, I'd be like, dude.
And 354 days, and he's like fucking them out.
Abort mission. This is bullshit.
Yep. Oh shit. Nick hit 108. What happened? He just hit 108, guys.
That's
Never
all he
mind.
needed.
Yep. 108, and he was done. Game over.
So this was a good conversation because, like, I won't say that I changed my opinion. I think that a lot of I did change my opinion by researching the topic. I think the conversation itself didn't make me change my opinion anymore, but I think just getting into it and trying to be aware of political correctness expanded my perception of political correctness, because for the longest time, really all the way up until I started looking into this, so many things would make me like roll my eyes. Like, that's what we're going to fight over right now. And I still would think that I could find myself doing that because I find a lot of the conversations trivial. However, what I've learned to appreciate and accept is that this does have a place and a role that is playing, but I think it's smaller than what people make it out to be, because it goes back to my thoughts around, I think political correctness is usually at play amidst much broader, large-scale movements.
Definitely. Yeah, I think for me, my perspective probably did change a little, because as I'm, just kind of here in the moment talking about, come on, people, both sides of this thing are stupid. Like, chill the fuck out and have a conversation. learn. Realizing, oh, you need to do that, Tony. Okay, well, gave myself some good tips.
Well, so to be fair, I had that mindset before looking into this, but it wasn't even that like somebody said something to change my mind. It was just the exercise of having the thoughts and trying to chase down the root of my thoughts.
Right. Same here. And typically my response prior to this conversation is I roll and disengage. I'm not hurting anything. I'm not helping anything either. But realizing, oh, not everyone can see the vision I have of the bridge and the potential for how these people, shake hands and still disagree, but shake hands instead of throwing rocks at each other. Oh, hey guys, you know that you can just be friends and not agree. What?
Yeah.
What?
Or not be friends. You don't have to be friends with everybody.
Right.
Like, that's okay too.
Or, you know what? The thing that I love about Democrats and Republicans is they're different perspectives, because the different perspective helps you see like a fucking penny, right? Looking at two different sides of the coin. Sure, some of those things don't always work together, but I think that the opposing views of things and the healthy discussion with it helps advance things in a way exponentially faster than if everyone was just an echo chamber just looking at the same one
Well,
thing.
I don't know if I would say that it advances things faster. I think it slows things down.
With the open conversation.
And I think it makes you have a more nuanced solution, like a more nuanced outcome that's actually successful.
Sure. Okay, I'll give you that.
Do you disagree?
I followed in my head and I'm like, yeah, okay, that's pretty much what I was saying.
Okay. One thing that I said at the start of the episode about coercion, this is something that I had written down. Not that it's going to be like some quote that you're going to go put up on your fucking wall, but just a thought that I kind of came to the conclusion of along the way that I was thinking about political correctness. And that is, I'd rather have political correctness, which evolves organically from within society, than coerced language that's mandated externally by an authority such as government.
Dude, that's really fucking good.
And that's something that has come up. Like, there's that C-16 bill in Canada that's talking about the transgender pronouns. I don't want government to have to tell us what language to use.
We were talking about this at work with my team. We were talking about how to create culture inside of the people we were trying to influence. And in doing that, we had to define culture. And what we came up with was that culture is when the group of people collectively agree to a set of rules or terms that are pretty much unspoken. When you try to mandate those things, now it becomes rules and something to push against. And so I think that's exactly what you're saying. And it's interesting that we're kind of coming to these same definitions.
Yes, 100%. Spot on.
Yeah. So I think, kind of to wrap this all up into a nice little bow, political correctness can be a great fucking thing if people use it in a way that's organic and shifts culture. But all of those things, it's a great big fucking ship that's got to turn slowly, and people have to realize that. Instead of it being this mandated thing that you're walking the plank if you fuck up.
Poke, poke. Guys, thanks for listening in. Really appreciate it. And if you made it this far, I just want to say a particular thank you, because the open-mindedness that is required to hold conversations like this is something that is hard to come by, or it seems that way. And we just want to do more of it.
For sure. And if we missed anything or got something horribly wrong, hit us in the comments, either on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on Spotify, Apple, anything else, shoot on over to Instagram and, drop in our DMs, or, comment on one of our posts. We'd love to hear it.
Peace out.